study of chapter 3 of Pirkei Avot. For those following on internet and the website, today is the 5th day of February, and it is cold and rainy. But I'm glad all of you made it here today. We are studying the third chapter, as I mentioned. I'm sorry, what?
Was there a class last Wednesday?
You can watch it on the internet. Yeah. We had a discussion about the place of government, if you'll remember, and this very interesting Mishnah about praying for the welfare of the government, which seems like a pretty odd kind of thing, especially during the time of the Roman occupation. And we read of tremendous suffering on the part of our rabbinic ancestors. Those of you who hang out on Yom Kippur in the afternoon, read the Eila Ezkara, the martyrology, where the horrific deaths of many of these sages are recorded as liturgy. And we have, interestingly, the Mishnah that we studied last week of Rabbi Hanina that says, pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the fear of it, people would swallow each other alive. And we discussed the political implications of that in some detail. And we talked about the juxtaposition of the first half of this Mishnah and the second. And in some editions of the Mishnah, I had mentioned the two sections are independent Mishnayot, but here, as in many other editions, the two are together. So the first part of that Mishnah, you'll remember, and it's on page 36 if you're following in the text, is that you should pray for the welfare of the government. And the second part of the Mishnah talks about if two people sit together and exchange no words of Torah, they're like an assembly of scoffers. When two sit and study Torah together, the divine presence dwells with them. We even learn that if one person sits and studies Torah, then the divine presence is with that individual as well. And one of the points that we had made at the end of the class last week is what are these two texts coming together to state as a unit? And there was a lovely comment made at the very, very end of the class, I think it was even after the recording was turned off, that one should pray for the welfare of the government, but maintain one's Jewish identity in their home. In other words, that if a strong and hopefully just central government will protect the rights of each individual. And if that takes place, then Jewish people can be free to practice their own Judaism at home, in particular around the table. And that's always been sort of the Jewish approach, as we talked about, to secular government. And that's the model of American government too. The purpose of government and law in the United States is to make sure that your neighbors don't hurt you. Basically, it's to protect your right to do what you want within the confines of law and nobody impinging on your right to do so, which is not at all what Jewish law is about. Jewish law is my responsibility to take care of you. It's very, very different, almost the antithesis of secular law, where we have responsibility for one another. Secular law is we're all independent entities, and each independent entity has the right to its own self-existence. The Jewish law is we're all interdependent, and just like your finger can't hurt without the rest of your body hurting, if any one part of the body hurts, the entire body suffers as well. But most of the time, we have not lived as authorities in our own land. And so we pray for the welfare of the government. And we talked about at some length, and I'm not going to go into it again, the concept of Dina de Malchut Dina that we talked about that the law of the land, the secular law of the land, is the law, unless it specifically contradicts Jewish law. Our goal, as we talked about, we gave a couple of biblical references and rabbinic references as well, is God didn't put us into the diaspora to stir up trouble, but to draw people closer to God. And so if we're constantly at loggerheads with the society around us, then we can't be that force for good, influencing others and drawing them closer to God. And so that's why that mission is in part there. I talked also a little bit last week by way of recap that it's also politically expedient, that anybody who was reading this could say, the Jewish people are not a fifth column, the Jewish people are part of the society around them, they even pray for the welfare of the government. So one could cynically say today that the reason why we still have a prayer for the government during our Torah service is exactly the same thing, because we want to never be accused of dual loyalty. So at the very moment when we're reading our set of laws in the Torah, we pray for the government and the secular laws as well, to make it very clear that we don't have a dual set of loyalty. We're loyal Americans, and we are proud citizens. And I think that historically that's probably how that prayer came to be in that part of the service, the prayer for the government. And it's interesting that even in the most traditional of shuls, of which we are liturgically very traditional, that prayer is always said in English. So that anybody who is coming and visiting us, non-Jewish people, have something to pray, but they also can look and say, this is Jewish people are praying on behalf of the government as all. It goes all the way back to this Mishnah, really from the first century. Interesting historical background. So this idea of the 3-2-1, 3 people who gather, 2 people who gather, 1 person who gathers, carries over into this next Mishnah. And that's what we're going to study today. We're going to look at Mishnah, chapter 3, Mishnah number 3, that says, Rabbi Shimon would say, and this is the bottom of page 37 if you're in the textbook, Rabbi Shimon would say, if 3 have eaten at one table and not spoken words of Torah, it is as if they have eaten sacrifices offered to the dead. Yeah. Even Scripture says, all their tables are filled with filth and vomit without the divine presence. This is a beautiful chapter, you'll remember. You'll remember Mishnah number 1, right? And we'll come back to these sources because the biblical sources are very interesting in their context. However, 3 who have eaten at one table and have spoken words of Torah, Scripture states, he said to me, this table is in the presence of God, which doesn't make much sense in its context, but by the end of the class, that reference to Ezekiel, I think, will be more plain to you. So a couple of points to start out with here, one in this Mishnah. So first, who is Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon is none other than Shimon Bar Yochai, who is a pretty famous sage. He was one of Rabbi Akiva's students.
The one that they snuck out.
No. No, Rabbi Shimon Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yeah. No, Shimon Bar Yochai is most famous for the 13 years he spent in a cave. You might remember that story. And so you're giving me like 13 years in a cave. What did he wear? so the sages were bothered by that too, Shirley. You're not alone in raising an eyebrow about Shimon Bar Yochai. But Shimon Bar Yochai was a famous student of Rabbi Akiva. You remember Rabbi Akiva was martyred, in fact, because he led a rebellion, the Bar Kokhba revolts, around 135 of the Common Era, which led to wholesale slaughter of Jewish people. But Shimon Bar Yochai was a student of Rabbi Akiva who, interestingly, became famous for criticizing the Roman government. And why is it interesting? Because it's juxtaposed to the Mishnah that we just had, which said pray for the government. And here, where the next Mishnah quotes a guy who not only did he criticize the government, but as a result had to flee for his life because there was a warrant out for him, an edict of death. And so he and his son hid in a cave in Meron for 13 years. And in fact, God caused a carob tree to grow outside of it so they could grab food to eat. They only wore their clothes periodically so as not to wear it out. There's all kinds of stories about them. He purportedly wrote the most famous of mystical texts called the Zohar. And eventually he comes out, the story says, of the cave after a certain amount of time. And he sees Jewish people going about their daily chores, drawing water and farming and things like that. And his intensity of spending so much time doing nothing but studying Torah makes his eyes like some Marvel superhero. And he looks at them, and whatever he looks at bursts into flames. And so God says to Shimon Bar Yochai, back in the cave until you get a better attitude. And when he comes back out, he's more accepting of the people around him. So he was not exactly what one would call an easygoing kind of guy, Shimon Bar Yochai, which also helps us to understand a little bit more maybe of the sources that he quotes here as well. Before...
Isn't he the rabbi that, you have your haircuts, you go to Meron and in Spot?
His yahrzeit is Lag BaOmer. Yes. Shimon Bar Yochai. Before we get into the text that Shimon Bar Yochai quotes here, so if three have eaten at one table and not spoken words of Torah, Israel, Bezalel Steinhardt, who we've used for our Ramah trips and our confirmation trips, and was also the guide for my culinary trip as well. He had an interesting post on Facebook in regard to Jewish people sharing Torah. So this is what he wrote. I'll read it to you. This is another only in Israel moment. So this was a post, I don't know, about a week ago on Facebook. He said, came down tonight to go shopping. Flat tire awaiting me. Changed it to the spare, but the spare was too soft to drive on. Ended up taking a cab to the gas station with the spare tire, pumping it up and returning by cab to my house. The reason this is status worthy is that the cabbie saw my predicament and told me a Devar Torah from Parshat Truma to calm me down. He said the reason why it says all the Mishkan building instructions were given once, and then again, the same instructions when they were actually built in a few parshiot from now, is to remind us that sometimes things don't go according to plan in building something, but sometimes they do. And the challenge is to find a reason why things don't go according to plan. It must be for a reason. For example, my eloquent cabbie continued, if you didn't get that flat, we wouldn't have met each other. only in Israel. So three who have eaten and not discussed words of Torah. The assumption is that people together would have Torah to talk about. But it's interesting also, I want to draw to your attention the significance of the number 3, because 3 has a technical distinction in meals. It's called a mezuman, which literally means an arrangement or invited. 2 people sit down for a meal. It's a coincidence. It's a snack. It's whatever. But when 3 people get together, it's usually for a purpose. They decide we're going to have a meal together. And when you get 3 people together, that constitutes, quote unquote, an official meal. And that's when Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals, is introduced with Rabotai Nevarech. If you're eating with 2 or less, or you're benching on your own, you don't start with the Rabotai Nevarech, the Shema Nevarach, where the people call and respond. That's only with the Mezuman with 3, based on this idea that's a set or a fixed or invited meal. And so what, and another aspect of this, by the way, is that what Rabbi Shimon is saying is that Torah should accompany every meal. And one of the ways, we discussed this last time, one of the ways that came to fruition is through the addition of brachot, of blessings, of making motzi before, and making birkat hamazon, blessings afterwards. And by the way, the source of grace after meals, if you're looking at it, is Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 10. So you will eat and be satisfied, and you will bless Adonai your God for the good land that he has given to you. V'achalta v'savata, you'll eat, uverachta, and you will bench, you will bless. So that's why in Jewish tradition, grace always comes after the meal, not before. We say the blessing of the particular food we're going to eat, but we say the full appreciation for it after we have eaten it, but based on this verse, Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 10. Okay. So, three people sit together, and they have a meal, and they need to speak words of Torah. Now, after Shimon Bar Yochai is writing this, he lived somewhere 135 to 170 of the Common Era. So he's living between 60 and 100 years after the destruction of the temple. So what happened in that time period of his life that was probably the most transitional, one of the most transitional times in Jewish life? We lost the temple. And so how did the rabbis compensate for the loss of the temple? Many different ways. But one of them was the Talmud specifically tells us that the home became a mikdash ma'at, a little temple. So the central temple was destroyed, and in part, lots of satellite, an infinite number of satellite temples started in your home. And the Talmud, the rabbi specifically said that the parts of the temple and the temple ritual would now be recreated in your home. So for instance, your shulchan, your table, became the mizbeach, the altar. And that the sacrifice that we made was no longer animal sacrifice, but prayers and words of Torah study. And that the food we ate on it was in part reminiscent, although not a full reenactment, of the food we would eat at the time of the temple. That's why, to this day, when we make motzi on a challah, we put salt on it, because the sacrifices were salted as well. It's a 2,000-year-old tradition. The sacrifices were themselves salted. And various elements of the temple are still recreated. Like, for instance, they had lechem hapanim, we read about in the Mishkan, which is called the showbread in English. Doesn't really tell you anything. But what in the Mishkan, this is before we had the temple in Jerusalem. This is the traveling tabernacle. They had a big table, compartmentalized table that had place for 12 loaves of bread, and they were replaced weekly, and they were called the showbread. People could look at them. That's why they're called showbread, because they were on display. And when the Mishkan and the temple were destroyed, challah came to replace the lechem hapanim. And they had a brass wash basin called the kior, nechoshet, and where they would symbolically, ritually wash hands before eating of the sacrifice. And to this day, we wash our hands symbolically with the natla, the name for that two-handed cup using two hands so that the impurities from one hand doesn't transmit to that other handle. That's why it has two. Those cups traditionally have two handles, even though laws of ritual impurity don't apply anymore because we don't have the temple anyhow. But again, it's a reminiscent of the temple back then, and also to this day we set up near where we eat usually our Shabbos candles, which are reminiscent of the menorah. And when you put all of those pieces together on Shabbos, you really can understand how the table becomes like a mikdash ma'at. And so and Rabbi Shimon's statement makes perfect sense. When you're making the temple and you're making this dwelling place for God, you need to share words of Torah. You need to bring the faith alive and into the next generation. So mikdash ma'at, small temple. It's an interesting statement in the Talmud in Brachot. If you want to look this up online, it's Brachot 54b. Rabbi Yehuda says there are three things when prolonged extend a person's days and years. If you prolong these three things, you will, according at least to Rabbi Yehuda, live a longer life. Marty, you're very curious, I can see. Right. Well, what are those three things?
Yeah.
And I don't think it has anything to do with exercise, right?
Well,
Exercise your mind, maybe.
This was Rabbi Yehuda.
Okay. Where is
So the three things in Brachot 54. So the three things are, these three things, when prolonged, will extend a person's days and years. You ready?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first one is prayer. So take a longer time to pray. Don't rush through your davening. Really? I know. Seriously. Yeah, we're good at
It'll
that.
make it like it feels
Rash-
like it's been a long time.
Rash-
So already it's increased.
The first one is prayer. The second one is extend your time in the bathroom.
Oh my gosh.
You already do that.
That they should have a long life, according to Rabbi Yehuda.
Oh, wait.
And the third,
How do they say it in Hebrew? Extend your...
Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Shlosha devarim ma'arichin yamav ushnotav shel adam. Ma'arich b'tfilato, ma'arich b'veit hakisei. Veit hakisei, in the house of the chair. The throne room, as we say. Ma'arich al shulchano. And the person, it literally means who extends his table.
Invites people.
Right. So one way of reading it exactly is adds a leaf
Or extend
for inviting other people to your table. We always had a tradition, particularly of inviting people in need, strangers, right, wayfarers, people
Oh my God.
to your table.
Fascinating.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
or prolonged
Ann, could you
meal.
just close the door? I'm just doing a lot of noise. Thanks. Yeah. So literally, like add a leaf to your table, add years to your life. It's kind of an interesting supposition. Okay.
But maybe it means prolongs the meal.
Right. Maybe it means not just to prolong the table itself, but prolong the time that you spend at the table, which in context seems to make more sense.
Right.
It doesn't say make a bigger bathroom and make longer services. It says spend more time in prayer and more time there. And right, but clearly, Shirley, one of the ways that the rabbis do read it is literally extend your table. Extend the invitation to your table, make your table longer, bring more people in, and there's probably very good reason for that, because the social interaction of being involved in community brings out something inside of you, draws other people together. That need for community is a very healthy one, and so that's probably pshat, simple meaning of the
Does it say Marich et Shulchan or does it say Marich al Shulchan?
al.
Which means
On. So I would say that kind of implies that you extend your meal, but by extending invitations to people, you're going to obviously prolong it.
Mm-hmm. I think it also means eat meals slower. I think that it actually really means to extend the time you spend at the table, and that also means it's conducive to sharing words of Torah and learning and that sort of thing. Because if you spend more time there, you have more worthwhile conversation. I have done several funerals recently, within the past couple of years, where people said to me, in fact, I will tell you where this, the B'Shem Amro, Tilly and Milt, or when Milt passed away, their kids said to me, we always had meaningful conversation around our dinner table, not just about what was going on in our lives, but what was going on in the world. And their parents lived till their 90s, and they remembered this from the time that they were that they were children, that there was enough time to be able to really kick back and tell stories and analyze life in general. There's an interesting study that was done in 2001 at the University of Michigan, which, in preparing for this, I came across. And it showed that families who share more meal times together, or the ones who share the most meal times together, raise children who are healthier, both physically and emotionally, and who do better in school. That there's a direct correlation between the length and consistency of mealtime and their ability to thrive, even academically. Very, very interesting. And the study went on to show, and I think the common sense, it says, that a person's going to be well adjusted if they spend more time together with their family. They're not rushing from here to there. Everybody gets a chance to talk to each other, etc. But the study goes on, interestingly, and they divided up what actually got spoken about at the table. Not simply, what did you do at school today? Nothing. Pass the mashed potatoes. But they said that the families who shared family lore and family stories, family traditions around the table actually got the most benefit. And not just like, well, in my day, we walked to school uphill both ways in the rain, and now you have it so easy. Or not just like, in my day, Camden was so beautiful and everything was safe. Now today, you kids, you can't even walk to the school bus. But rather, the in-between that was like the stories of our family that we went through together, the ups and downs, that shows resilience and unity as a family, to share those family things that were both triumphs and travail, happy times together and sad times, to recount those stories around the table on a regular basis was ultimately what made for resilient and healthy kids. And so it goes directly to what Rabbi Yehuda is saying about extending the table. There's
Did he get a do-over now?
Well, you're still at the table, but what they were talking about, the quote that I took away from this was the web of connection. That the table becomes a place to build connections, family connections, social connections, and is what Shimon Bar Yochai is saying, spiritual connections. So that when you add into it an element of Torah. And here we're talking not necessarily only chapter and verse, but Jewish topics, topics of Jewish interest. When you can weave that into your everyday conversation, then obviously that's going to become part of the fabric of the family as well.
I think that's what's so important about Shabbat. No matter if you, in my family, my kids tell me, they run around like maniacs, dropping off, picking up all week, but they always know that at least on Friday night and Shabbat lunch, they are together.
Right, that you're always going to have Shabbos together. Exactly. I have the same, I have the same story. My life when my kids were little was, was run. But, which is, by the way, why we, under my tenure, have never had a late Friday night service, or very rarely, because they can't have time together at the table. But yeah, you light the candles, and then you have Shabbos together. I always say that the greatest gift that parents today can give their kids is Shabbos dinner, because it's the most powerful statement to them that there's nothing more important in my life than being with you right now. There's no meeting that's more important. There's no phone call. There's no email. There's no movie I'd rather see. There's no client I would rather entertain. There's no friends I'd rather be with than you. And when you do that consistently, your kids come to understand that web of connection that we're talking about here in that Gemara. Yeah.
All right, there's a commercial on TV now, I think it's from Cheerios, talks about the breakfast project, about let's have a family breakfast together.
Really?
And they're calling it the breakfast project, like it's a big chidush, which again talks about the
sharing meal times.
Of sharing meal times.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd be so good at sharing breakfast, but but meal times for sure, and of course Shabbos. And so the text, interestingly, that Rabbi Shimon brings as a quote here, and is from the book of Psalms, if you'll see on the top of page 38. And one of the things, Anne, that I was talking about last week, and anyone else who wasn't here, whenever, and this goes not only for Pirkei Avot, but in all of rabbinic texts, and particularly in Talmudic texts, whenever you see a biblical quote, you have to understand that it's just a tagline for something more. That they're not going to quote 10 verses that might be necessary to get the whole point across. They're just going to give you the kunz, the little, that one little line. And so it behooves you, when you're studying these texts, to take out a Tanakh, a Hebrew Bible. My wife was commenting that she had been in a number of different people's homes over the past 6 months, and she said, it's amazing how many Jewish people don't have a Bible, a full Hebrew-English Bible in their homes. So it would be an interesting survey. But anyhow, you should take out the Bible and read the verses. You don't have to read them in anything but English, but to figure out the particular context. And it has, and if you look at this particular text, Rabbi Shimon says, if 3 have eaten at one's table and not spoken words of Torah, it is this: they have eaten sacrifices offered to the dead. And then the reference is, see Psalms 106, Psalm number 106 of the 150 Psalms, verse number 28. So I backed it up a few verses to be able to get the context of it. And here's the rest of that psalm. Or not the rest of it, but a significant part of it, starting with verse 21. They forgot God who saved them, who did all the great things for them in Egypt, wonders in the land of Ham, fearsome deeds by the sea of Suf, the Red Sea. Therefore, he said that he would destroy them, and he would have, had Moses, his chosen one, not stood before him in the breach to turn back his destroying fury. Next, they rejected the beautiful land. They didn't trust his promise, and they complained in their tents, and they didn't obey Adonai. Therefore, raising his hand, he swore to them that he would strike them down in the desert and strike down their descendants among the nations, dispersing them in foreign lands. Now they joined themselves in Baal Peor and ate meat sacrificed to dead things. That's the reference here. Thus they provoked him to anger with their deeds, so that a plague broke out among them. So what's Rabbi Shimon doing? He's telling the story of the Exodus, giving a verse about the Exodus that has to do with food and eating, that they ate meat sacrificed to dead things. In other words, they were in some kind of a pagan worship. To be able to tell the story of our people, that web of connection. You are descended from people who pushed God to the limit, but then reformed, but then pushed God to the limit, but then followed Moshe, back and forth. And so basically what he's doing is he's bringing the source of studying some section of Torah. Here, of course, it's from the writings, the book of Psalms, that's telling the story of the Jewish people, kind of what I was talking about in that University of Michigan study, where when you tell the stories of how you became who you are today, it gives your family that sense of rootedness and connection that seems to promote well-being and emotional and even physical stability. So lengthening the time at the table is important because conversation brings people together. And if we believe that the table is now the altar, then reading a passage about bringing offerings to the dead means that we are denying the fact that we can make the table into a place that's sacred, discarding the stories of our people, and instead we should turn that around and realize it is a mikdash ma'at, it does have the potential for holiness, and that at that place we can tell the stories of our people, which is what I think Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai means by three people sharing words of Torah. So we're going to stop with this. We're going to with this psalm here. We'll continue the second half of this Mishnah and study a little bit of Isaiah and Ezekiel and talk a little bit more about food and table topics, because it's always a good topic. We will not be meeting next week, but our next session, when we will continue with this Mishnah, will be, God willing, 2 weeks from today.
All right, Rabbi.